Audio's rolling, camera's rolling. All right, Tim, action.
Hello, my name's Tim Malone, and I'm a retired American history teacher. And I've been recording my lectures for my YouTube channel, Tim Malone History Lectures on YouTube. Check it out. Today I'm going to talk about the Great Depression and the New Deal, or I'm going to start to talk about them. The Great Depression, the most important economic event in United States history, a huge economic event. And it's very complicated, nuanced discussion about the Great Depression and the response to it called the New Deal. Most history textbooks cover these two topics. There's two topics, the Great Depression and the New Deal. They cover them in one chapter. Alan Brinkley, textbook that I've referenced in previous lectures, he's kind of alone in treating them in two separate chapters, and I'm going to treat them as in two separate lectures. The Great Depression brought about the New Deal. Together, they changed American history profoundly, not just economic history, but all of American history. The Great Depression was a course-altering event in American history, a very influential, impactful event, the Great Depression. 1929, and the dating of the Great Depression and the New Deal is also nuanced and controversial. 29, everybody starts 1929, the great crash on Wall Street in October of 1929. And then American entry into World War II in 1941, 1929 to 1941. But as I just mentioned, the impact of the Great Depression is felt today. As much as World War II, the impact of World War II, another gigantic event in American history. The Great Depression. I tell the story that my mom and dad, may they rest in peace, were children of the Great Depression. My dad was born in 1916, so he was 13 years old when the crash came in 29. My mom was born in 1920, so she was 9 years old. So they were children, adolescents of the Great Depression. And they talked about it. And one of the things that, if you would have asked my mom and dad, and I did, and they did talk about this, what caused the Great Depression? Because that's what we're going to get into here in a few minutes. The causes of the Great Depression. Controversial, nuanced, complicated, contested. Causes of the Great Depression. If you would have asked my mom and dad, they would have said, the stock market crashed in October of 1929. Duh. Well, it's not that simple. I don't think, as a historian studying the event. I'm not saying my mom and dad were wrong, but we'll get into causes here in a minute. The Great Depression is the most important economic event in U.S. history. More than any other event, the Great Depression haunts our culture today. The big question is, can it happen again? Can we have another Great Depression? Now, in 2008, 2009, we had an event called the Great Recession, when the housing market collapsed and pulled the economy down with it. The worst downturn in our economy since the Great Depression in 2008, 2009, 2010. We'll talk about the Great Recession when it comes up. And so I think that most observers, and myself included, think, yes, it can happen again, despite the fact that the Great Depression occurred and then the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt, our most popular president, our most popular politician, elected 4 times, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, brought the New Deal to treat the Great Depression. And part of that was regulation, government regulation of our markets, particularly the stock market. Regulation. And so a lot of people would say, well, no, we could never have something as bad because we're smarter, because we learned from history. Then the Great Recession happened in 2008, 2009, and it wasn't as bad. It was bad, but not as bad, because we had institutions and laws and reforms in place that came about as a result of the Great Depression that mitigated when the housing market crashed in 2007, 2008, bringing banks down. We'll talk about that in the future. Can it happen again? The Great Depression highlights the importance of economics in history because it's such an economics. Oh man, economics. Economic determinism, a theory of history, that the most important events in history are economic. That the economy, this thing we call the economy, is the most important determinant of the course of history of a country or a civilization or a society. Economics rules. There's that famous saying from the 1992 campaign for president when Bill Clinton was elected the first time, and his motto for his campaign, James Carville, his campaign manager, had it in the office, campaign office, it's the economy, stupid. Meaning that's what a politician should talk about. It's the economy, stupid, the most important factor in our politics. In the trajectory of our history is the economy. Now, that's a complicated subject, the economy. There's, of course, entire departments at university called economics department. I never took an economics course, but I've been heavily engaged with economic history. It's Brad DeLong, the economic historian at Berkeley, in California, University of California at Berkeley, who says, of course, he's an economic historian, of course he'd say, you're better off reading economic history than economics. You're better off, you'll learn more, you'll be better informed about the economy by studying its history than by studying what they study in economics courses in the economics department. I'm a historian, so I agree with that. The Great Depression. The Great Depression is the, and in my notes here I have the, capital T-H-E, underlined, bold, the failure of capitalism. Capitalism. I think the best description of the type of economics that we have in the United States. We're capitalists. We have a capitalistic system. Now, I have a lecture on capitalism. And to tell you the truth, sitting here right now, I don't know of the 22 or 23 I have up on my YouTube channel if I've done my capitalism one yet. Another complicated, nuanced, contested term. But I think it's best. There's different types of economies. And what we have, and what pretty much dominates the world now, with the fall of the Soviet Union in the late 90s, late 80s, with the fall of the alternative communist system, the world pretty much is all capitalistic, mostly. Again, it's nuanced. We'll talk about that. Of course, our politics in the United States, and this is 2025, is dominated, both parties, everybody is a capitalist, damn near. There's a few people in America who call themselves socialists. We'll talk about that. Capitalists. Capitalism dominates the world. And yet, capitalism can fail spectacularly, can create poverty and international chaos and bring about wars. That's a historical fact. The Great Depression is the failure of capitalism. It can happen. Capitalists try to deny it. Hardcore capitalists try to deny it. They try to bury the Great Depression and the Great Recession too. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about the fact that this system that dominates our economy, the getting and using of resources, the economy, brings us the necessities of life, our economy: food, shelter, medical care, employment, education. This system can implode. It can implode. The Great Depression, proof positive, undeniable, of one of the glaring weakness of this system we so praise and so rely on, capitalism. The failure of capitalism, the Great Depression. The Great Depression highlights part of the same problem, this instability, this propensity for instability in the system. We call it the boom and bust cycle. Capitalism inherently has a boom and bust cycle: prosperity and then crisis, and wealth, creation of wealth, and then the disappearance of wealth. Boom and bust cycle. It highlights capitalism's susceptibility to what we call speculative bubbles. The system is kind of based on speculative bubbles where the money, the people with the money, chase after markets, a panic. It's almost like a panic, speculative bubbles. In 1929, between the end of World War I and 1919 and 1929, the area of speculation was the stock market. And since that time, the speculative area has usually been the stock market. Some would say, we're 2025 right now, that we have a stock market bubble right now, that the market's overbought, and that we're headed towards some sort of correction. But this is inherent in the system. Now, the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt and his reforms created the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Federal Reserve Bank reformed its regulatory functions, and there's supposed to be watchdogs. There's supposed to be somebody watching. And the government can take actions to mitigate the speculative bubble so that when it pops, it doesn't destroy the economy like the Great Depression did, like the stock market crash in 29 and the Great Depression. A huge, we have instruments in place. We have bureaus. We have bureaucrats. We have panels watching and mitigating. The downturns still come. We call them recessions now because the term depression was used up. I tell the story that, 1929, the Great Depression happened, and so it was called the Great Depression. And so then our leaders and our pundits, decide, well, we're not going to call these inevitable downturns depressions anymore. That's too painful. So, we'll call them recessions. And that's what we'll call them. And so then we got the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. And so that's gone. So now what are we going to call them? Downturns? It's funny how that PR works. The boom and bust cycle of capitalism. They're inevitable. Now, right now, President Trump is a conservative, capitalist, capital C, capitalist. He's weakening the New Deal reforms. He's fired a bunch of people at the Securities and Exchange Commission, fired a bunch of people at the Federal Reserve. He's going back to unregulated capitalism. Unregulated capitalism steered us right into the Great Crash and the Great Depression. And to me, it's foolishness. it's foolishness to take the guardrails down and to go back to the sort of Wild West speculative environment that brought us the Great Depression. It can happen again. The Great Recession, the housing market, it wasn't the stock market, it was the housing market that, and I was a homeowner, so I guess I was all for it on the way up. But then, like all speculative bubbles, there's a day of reckoning, and wham, Lehman failed, and Bear Stearns failed, and the banks failed, which is what happened during the Great Depression. Again, we talk about the importance of the financial system to a capitalist economy, the importance of banks, stock brokerage firms, hedge funds, now all kinds of things that I can scarcely even understand. Speculative bubbles. We're in one right now. Capitalism. I don't think I've done my lecture on capitalism. I should do that soon. Get the history of capitalism. Capitalism giveth and capitalism taketh away. Another point about the Great Depression. The Great Depression brings to power Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and I've mentioned him before. Elected president in 1932. The crash happens in 1929. Herbert Hoover, a conservative Republican, is president when the crash happens in October of 1929. And being a conservative, hardcore capitalist, he doesn't think the government should do anything. He doesn't think the government should do anything. The theory back then, laissez-faire capitalism, was you ride it out. You ride the downturns out. That the downturns not only are inevitable in a capitalist system, but they're good. They're good. Ride them out. Ride the down, because it'll purge the system of bad debt. It'll purge the system of the speculative bubble, and we'll come back stronger. We'll come back stronger. Now, to me, that's nonsense, and was pretty much refuted economically by the great British economist John Maynard Keynes, who came to prominence during the Depression. John Maynard Keynes. And his answer, and it's misquoted a lot, when someone said, ride it out, ride the downturn out, we'll come back, in the long run we're better off. And Keynes' response to that was, in the long run we're all dead. And the point he's making is, if you can do something to mitigate the pain, you do it. You don't just say, let's ride it out, it'll be better in the long run. In the long run? Meanwhile, you're sitting on your hands. You could help the unemployed, you could help the poor, you could help the homeless, but you're not going to do it because you'll be better off in the long run. That theory, that stance, that economic outlook is still prevalent today in the United States, 2025. There's still a powerful contingent of economists, and mainly in the Republican Party, conservatives, who still believe in the ride it out. Ride it out. No. Franklin Roosevelt and his New Dealers proved that the government can mitigate the pain. So why not do it? Especially a democratic government, one that's elected by the people. There's things you can do it. There's homeless people, there's hungry people, there's unemployed people. Franklin Roosevelt, the most popular politician in American history, a statement. I don't think there's any quibble because he was elected 4 times. Now, of course, the original Constitution didn't limit the number of terms a president could run for and be elected to. Washington only served 2 terms, 8 years, and then resigned. And he set an unwritten precedent that presidents only served 2 terms and then retired. Roosevelt in 1940, he's elected in 32, he's reelected in 36, one of the smashing victories of all time, the 1936 election. If you want to talk about whether his New Deal, whether his let's do something about this situation was popular, he was overwhelmingly elected in 32, defeating Hoover, the incumbent. Herbert Hoover, the let's ride it out guy, ran for re-election in 32, was smashed by Roosevelt, and then 4 years later, Roosevelt smashed even more. He was re-elected overwhelmingly. And then he decided with World War II on the horizon in Europe, and Roosevelt's a pro-British guy, like Wilson. And so he decides to break the unwritten rule, Roosevelt, and run for a third term. And he's overwhelmingly elected in 1940, not as much as 36, but almost. Then he runs for re-election again in 44 and is re-elected to a fourth term. And in 1944, the election of 1944, Roosevelt is a sick man. You see pictures of him, and he doesn't look good. And he's elected in November of 44 for his fourth term and is dead in April of 45. So he only serves 4 months of his fourth term. In 1944, Harry Truman is his vice president and serves out most of Roosevelt's fourth term. The American people elected a sick man in 1944, Franklin Roosevelt, to show you how popular he was. I make a joke and say when the Democrats are down on it, and they're up against a popular Republican running, that they ought to dig up Franklin Roosevelt's bones and run his bones for president, that his cadaver could probably win. He was so popular. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. My mom and dad thought he was a saint, they thought that he sat at the right hand of God. No, wait, that's Jesus. Second from the right, Franklin Roosevelt. In my classes when I taught, I had a little resuscitation for them, and it went like this. Remember this, kids. The Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal, and what's the most prominent legacy program of the New Deal today, still with us? There's several. The Securities and Exchange Commission is still with us. There's dozens of agencies and bureaus from Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal that are still with us today, 80 years later. But the primary, when you think Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt, New Deal, Social Security. Roosevelt brought us Social Security. Universal, mandatory, old age pension program run by the federal government. Universal, everybody's in. Old age pension run by the government. It has its own tax, the Social Security tax. Now, Social Security is much in the news, has been my entire life. I'm on Social Security now, being retired. I don't get much because I worked for the state most of my career. Social Security. And there's still people, politicians, conservatives, capital C capitalists, laissez-faire capitalists, Herbert Hoover types, Donald Trump types, who are not reconciled to Social Security. Now, it's really difficult to run for office in the United States saying, vote for me and I'm going to abolish Social Security. You're not going to get very far. But there are people who, if they were honest, they're politicians, if they were honest, they'd say that. They'd say, vote for me and I would abolish Social Security. If I had my druthers, I'd eliminate Social Security. Big government. We don't want the government running anything. Again, Social Security. And we'll come back and talk about this some more, but just now let me just say. Social Security. Yeah, let's be nice to Grandma and Grandpa. If Grandma was a stay-at-home homemaker and never had a job, or only had a few low-paying jobs in her life, and hard worker, good person, but didn't qualify for a private pension. She gets to be 65, 70, and grandpa dies, and maybe he didn't work for a company that had a pension. A lot of companies, especially small businesses, don't have pension plans. So you get too old to work, and what do you have? You didn't make enough money to have a savings account that's going to get you through the next 10, 15, 20 years. What are you going to do? Old age poverty was a terrible problem in this country until Franklin Roosevelt instituted Social Security. There's millions of elderly Americans whose only income is their Social Security check every month. They'd have nothing. They'd be living on nothing. They'd be out in the street, well, probably dead. And yet we still have people, conservatives, Republicans, who would abolish Social Security and go back to the old days. The snap of a finger, they do that. Social Security. So I want you, when you think about, when you hear, the Great Depression, when you hear Franklin Roosevelt, think Social Security. Now, Social Security, I don't know if I want to get into it now, but this idea that Social Security is going to be they've been saying that Social Security is going to go bankrupt my entire life, and I'm 70 years old. My entire life, those who oppose it say, well, we can't afford that. There's going to be too many old people in a few years. Social Security is going to go bankrupt. Social Security will never go bankrupt. Never. It has its own tax. Well, of course, the naysayers want to eliminate the Social Security tax. Franklin Roosevelt, the most popular politician in American history, he brought us the New Deal. And we've been talking about this just now, Social Security. I say that it might as well be called socialism security, because that's what it is. The idea, when Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s, when Social Security was implemented in the United States, Congress passed it, the idea of universal, government-run, old age pension was socialist, come from socialists. The idea came from Western European countries, France, Germany, before the darkness, Germany. Well, no, Hitler had Social Security. Those Social Security, universal old age, government-run pension was a European idea thought up by people who called themselves socialists. It's socialism. And yes, America, we have this huge program, billions of dollars, millions of people, and it's socialism. People talk about America, moving towards socialism. We're already there in that sense. We have a mixed economy. A mixture of what? Capitalism and socialism. We have a mix brought about primarily, of course, it was always a mix, right? There were always government-run programs, even before Roosevelt and the New Deal. But particularly with the Great Depression, the New Deal, the American government or the American economy becomes a mixed economy, a mixture of what? Capitalism and socialism. So there's a spectrum. Where are we? Now, of course, conservatives want to dial it back, bring it back to laissez-faire, no government programs, the smallest possible government you can have. The New Dealers, liberals, that's another thing we'll talk about here in a minute. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Dealers are the first quintessential American liberals. You think, where did this liberalism come from? The Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal. And what's its primarily program? Social Security. A mixture of capitalism and socialism. And we argue about moving the line a few ticks one way or the other. Well, I don't know. Again, the idea of universal government-run health care or universal government-run health insurance. That comes from Western Europe, from people who call themselves unapologetically socialists. Yes, socialized medicine. Every advanced country in the world has it except for us. And it works. They live longer, they live better, they're healthier. And yet, we can't do it here because it's socialism. Socialism, big government. No. Despite the fact that we already are considerably socialistic, especially, again, Social Security, welfare, Medicare and Medicaid. We are part of our medical insurance is already government run. Medicare and Medicaid. We're not. It's hard for me to fathom why we don't have socialized medicine. And I guess if we did, that's a huge sector of our economy, medical care. So the spectrum with a couple of ticks, if we socialize Medicare for everybody. It's simple. Medicare for everybody. We'd become more socialistic. But the capitalism isn't going away. The New Deal brings about income and demand stabilization programs. That's what I'm talking about, Social Security. It's not to be nice to Grandma and Grandpa. It's for the most practical of reasons, hard-headed reasons. You send the check to Grandma and Grandpa so they'll what? Spend it. Spend it. Demand. Demand. Oh, here we go. The economy, this thing we call the economy, which term came about 100 years ago or around 1900, around the time of the Industrial Revolution in America, the 1870s, 1890s, we started calling this thing the economy. And we instituted academic departments at universities called economics departments. The economy. Simplistically, it's supply and demand for products. Supply and demand, mitigated by price. You have supply and you have demand for that, and then that's arbitrated through price. Supply and demand. And it turns out that you can think of the politics of the economy as supply-siders and demand-siders. Now, again, you go back to Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, the first econ book, 1776. And then you got Ricardo, around 1800, another Englishman, who wrote a book about how this thing called the economy works, because there's mathematical formulas involved, supply and demand and price, like I've been talking about. And you can divide the world into supply-siders and demand-siders. And with the Great Depression, the supply-siders, and from Adam Smith all the way up to the Great Depression, supply-siders ruled economics. Economics was supply-side. Talking about factories and producing widgets and digging up coal and growing corn. Supply-side dominated. Comes the Great Depression and John Maynard Keynes, and I'm going to do a lecture on Keynesianism. John Maynard Keynes, the great English economist, demand side came into its own. Demand. Now, supply sider says, and Ricardo, right? Supply creates demand. You create widgets, and then there's a market for widgets. No. Demand creates supply. That's what the demand sider says. You don't have to worry about capitalists building widget factories if there's a demand for widgets. It doesn't start on the supply side, it starts on the demand side. And that's what Keynes brought That's what Roosevelt brought with the New Deal, demand. And that's what, if you want to think, again, let me repeat, you don't send a check through Social Security to grandma and grandpa because it's only the right thing to do. No, you do it for hard-headed economic reasons. It's demand maintenance. It's demand maintenance. What do you want grandma and grandpa to do with that money? Spend it. Demand. Create supply. Demand maintenance programs. Not just Social Security, welfare. The government sending checks to poor people. Boy, there's just conservatives hate that. You don't do it because you go, oh, we got to be nice, follow Jesus, blessed are the poor. No, you send poor people checks because you want them to what? Spend it. Demand side. The Great Depression, New Deal, signals the triumph of the demand side economics. And they're still with us. The Great Recession back in 2008, 2009, the housing market collapsed, brings down banks. There's banks threatened. What did the government do? They sent money, they bail out the banks. And I'm as outraged as that, bailing out these stupid bankers who made these stupid decisions. But you do it to save the system. Hoover, president, when the crash occurred and banks collapsed, wouldn't do it. Laissez-faire, ride it out. No. If you can do something to mitigate the pain, do it. As distasteful as it may be to bail out Wall Street, yeah, that's what you do to augment demand. Deposit insurance, another New Deal thing. My money in the bank is guaranteed by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. I don't know if they call it that anymore. But if my bank is stupid, and oh man, I used to make jokes in class about if you want to be fat and lazy and rich and stupid, become a banker, because banks are guaranteed from failure by the federal government. That was one of the reforms of the New Deal. And again, it's distasteful as hell to bail out idiotic bankers, but that's what you have to do to keep the system from plunging into the depths. Again, let me repeat, the New Deal brings about the triumph of Keynesian economics, Keynesianism, demand-side economics. John Maynard Keynes, or I'm going to do a lecture on Keynesianism. The Great Depression and the New Deal create the link between economic performance and politics. I talked about this earlier. It's the economy, stupid. And they say the reason that Trump was reelected last November, in November 2024, was because the electorate was convinced that he would better handle the economy than the Democrat that was running. I can't remember her name. Gone quickly. Right? Oh, Harris, right. That it's the economy, stupid, that Americans vote their pocketbook. Well, that's the result, primarily, that's the result of the Great Depression and the New Deal. The American people now expect the federal government, and again, this is contradictory. Even your hardcore conservative, laissez-faire, ride it out, conservative, votes wanting the government to do something when things go bad. They're conservative and laissez-faire only up to a point, because now we know that the government can do something. There's things the government can do to mitigate a downturn. That's not questionable. It's proven. Roosevelt did it. Now, primarily it was World War II that did it. What got us out of the Depression? Well, the New Deal, but the New Deal really didn't spend enough money. It was the mobilization for the war, World War II, that destroyed the Depression, that cured the Depression, that brought prosperity to America. And that's when the government took over almost the whole damn economy. World War II is proof that the government can create prosperity. Now, that's a hell of a way to create prosperity, a total war. But it can be done. There isn't any doubt about that the government can create prosperity. Now, of course, the conservatives today, the laissez-faire today, say, oh, that's bad prosperity. That's bad if the government does it. I don't know. The most important economic indicator is unemployment. And of course, unemployment went the highest it's ever been. Now, again, who keeps track of unemployment? One of the reforms of the New Deal was the government keeping track of the economy. It's the Labor Department, which was instituted during the New Deal, the Labor Department, keeps track of unemployment. How many Americans, how many workers want work but can't find it because the economy is depressed, because demand has been shot, because the bubble burst and money disappeared and banks went out of business and money disappeared. Unemployment, because there's a point at which unemployment would get high enough that it would cause social political instability in the country. Unemployment can get so bad that there's riots in the street, that the politicians in power are thrown out. That's what happened in Germany in 1933, right? Germany was particularly hard hit by the Great Depression. Unemployment was about 33%, and they went to the polls and voted in Adolf Hitler. Unemployment. Now, of course, unemployment insurance, sending checks to unemployed workers, is a New Deal reform. And again, why? Because you want those people to continue to spend. Demand. Send them some money. They're unemployed. They're going to spend it. They'll keep demand, and that'll create jobs. Unemployment. Now again, historians have studied unemployment, and 25% at the height of the Great Depression, 1934, 1933, 25% of American workers were unemployed, according to historical studies. Now again, it wasn't until the Labor Department was inaugurated as a reform of the New Deal that the government started officially keeping track of unemployment. But the best estimates are that 25% of American workers were unemployed. And we were on the verge of problems, riots in the street. There were some riots in the street. My dad, again, a child of the Great Depression, said that the country was on the verge of revolution if Roosevelt hadn't been elected and done something, right? Unemployment. So if you're going to keep track of one economic statistic, watch unemployment. Now, unemployment right now is 4.2%, which is historically relatively low. There's debate between supply-siders and demand-siders, between conservatives and liberals. There's debates about what the natural rate of unemployment should be when the economy is functioning, because nobody's ever going to be 100%. You're never going to have 100% employment. You're never going to have 0% unemployment. There's always going to be some people between jobs, and the economy's going to change, and widget makers, no more widgets, and there's always going to be dislocation. The lowest unemployment is in 1944, during the war, 1.2%. Now, that's never been that low in my life. I think in my life, I'm 74 years old. The lowest was 3 point something during the Vietnam War. Wars are good for economic prosperity if the wars are being fought in your country, of course. 3.3% in my lifetime. It's now 4.2%. And it's been relatively low. Now, I think, during the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, 2010, it got up to like 9.9 or right around 10. And that was considered a crisis. It's 4.2 now. It was 25% during the Great Depression in 1933. Unemployment. Now, of course, here in the last couple of years, inflation, the value of the dollar. A lot of pundits and commentators would say that the reason Trump was reelected in November of 2024, last year, was because the electorate thought that he'd do best in containing inflation, price rises. So I don't know. I've just told you that unemployment's the most important economic statistic. I guess number 2 would be inflation, keeping prices under control. Of course, Keynesianism, Keynes posited that a small amount of inflation is absolutely necessary for prosperity. And he said around 3%. You want 3% inflation. Now, of course, the Federal Reserve Bank, which is in charge of the money supply, and it sets interest rates and is concerned with inflation and is supposed to do things to keep inflation under control, they want 2% today, inflation. Nobody wants deflation. Nobody wants a regime of falling prices, because that's like a definition of a recession. That's like a definition of a downturn. Now, if you have 3% inflation every year, year after year, prices are going to double in like 30 years because it compounds. Prices are always going to go up. If you're out there sitting there thinking, I want prices to go down across the board. No. That's the definition of a recession, a regime of falling prices. I said earlier, Franklin Roosevelt's the founding or quintessential liberal. Show me a liberal in history. Okay, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Great Depression, in bringing Roosevelt to power, forged a political revolution in the United States, the effects of which are still very much with us today. I call it the New Deal synthesis. It's still with us. Now, President Trump is trying harder than any other conservative president, harder than Reagan back in the 80s, harder than the Bushes, to undo the New Deal. But I don't know if that's possible. The New Deal brought forth an economic and political revolution in the United States that's still with us. 80 years, 90 years. The New Deal. And how does it go? Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt, New Deal, Social Security.